Sometimes things happen that we can't quite put our finger on. We don't really know why they happened or how they happened. It's sort of outside of the realm of, our understanding. And, it's hard for us to compartmentalize what transpired, but, we always find a way. And, if you try hard enough, there's an old saying that goes, if you can't explain something, don't try, because you're gonna end up hurting yourself thinking too hard about that one. And you don't want to do that, because that's gonna mess you up in the long run. So if you could just reach into your pocket for me and oh, what's that in your hand? What you got there in your hand? You just pull out your pocket. What's that? Oh, that's 2 tickets. 2 tickets to the Bonkers Theater. Frank Latchford was enjoying his day so far. He was on his 3rd cup of coffee, diligently working on his work in front of him. He was an architectural designer and was working on a very important project for a very important client who was employed by a very important business. A lot rested on his shoulders, but he didn't mind at all. Most people would find being in such a situation to prove quite stressful, but for Frank, he didn't mind the stress at all. To be truthful, Frank actually enjoyed the stress. He reveled in it, and he yearned for more. Frank was a bit of a masochist in this sense, but not in some weird sexual way. He just enjoyed being in terrible, stressful situations that allowed for him to put his nose to the grindstone. Maybe this was so that Frank could enjoy life when not under these conditions, and so that he wouldn't take peaceful moments for granted. Maybe. But even Frank didn't know why he was like this. Frank would continue to work away on his project, now on his 4th cup of coffee. Frank always dealt so well with stress, but unbeknownst to him, he was about to live through the most stressful day of his life. A knock was heard at the door of Frank's office. "Come in," Frank sounded to the door. The door swung open to reveal Frank's boss. He was a tall, thin man with black hair and sunken eyes. He was quite frightening and ghoulish, but some people are just born that way. It's sad, but it happens sometimes. "Frank, how's the special project for our special customer coming along so far?" Frank pinched the crust out of his eyes and stood to his feet, dropping his drafting pencil to the ground awkwardly. "Everything is going really well, and I'm making a whole lot of really good progress on the designs," Frank answered. "I see," replied Frank's boss as he stared at Frank's eyes, which were red and had bags underneath them. Frank's boss then shifted his gaze towards Frank's desk adorned with the 3 empty and 1 almost empty cup of coffee. "Frank?" the man inquired. "Yes, sir," Frank replied. "You did remember to get your mandatory 8 hours of sleep, correct?" Frank perked up. "Of course I did. I actually got 9 hours of sleep last night. I always remember to get lots and lots of sleep, so I can be very productive throughout the day." But this was a lie. Frank didn't actually get 9 hours of sleep last night. In fact, Frank only got around 3 hours of sleep. You see, Frank was a big fan of a popular Japanese fantasy role-playing game series, and a new installment of the series had just come out the night before. Frank had pre-ordered the game and had spent all day playing the game into the early morning hours. Frank knew that his company required that all employees must get 8 hours of sleep every night, or else they get the whole. But Frank had been so enthralled by his new video game that he had lost track of time. "You just seem a little off today. I just wanted to make sure everything was alright," Frank's boss said. "Yes, everything is okay, and I think that this design will wow and amaze our client. It will make our prestigious company lots of money," Frank replied. "That's very good to hear," the boss said gleefully. "Well, I'll let you get back to it," the boss continued as he walked out the door, shutting it behind himself. Frank fell to the floor. "Do I really look that tired?" he anxiously thought to himself. "It's all okay. All I have to do is make it through one day. Just one day without falling asleep at my desk. And then, when I get home, I can fall asleep. I'll make sure not to stay up playing video games again, no matter how cool or fun they are." Frank then composed himself and picked up his pencil before seating himself back at his desk. Frank began working away on his designs once again, but within a few minutes of drawing and measuring, he began to feel his eyelids get heavy. His head began to bump up and down, and his vision began to tunnel. It wasn't until a bit of drool fell from his bottom lip onto his desk that he stood to his feet. "I can't work under these conditions. I need more coffee," he thought to himself as he looked up at his clock, noticing that only a few minutes had passed. This worried Frank because he knew he would have to be at work for the next 6 hours of the day, and wasn't sure he could make it through 6 hours without falling asleep. Frank sneaked his way out of the office, doing his best to not look really sleepy and tired like he actually was. It seemed like everyone was staring at him, but maybe it was no different than their normal glances they do when somebody is walking by. Frank would nod to his coworkers and smile and do his very best to wear his not sleepy face, despite being very, very sleepy. Frank made his way to the break room, a room that Frank personally dubbed the coffee zone. Frank was really quirky like that and would come up with funny little names to call common things. Frank thought this was hilarious, and he thought that his coworkers really enjoyed it a lot, but unbeknownst to him, it was actually one of his worst traits. When Frank entered into the break room, he was greeted by one of his coworkers standing in front of the coffee pot. His coworker was a small woman named Jessica, but her name doesn't really matter. Neither does her being a woman or small. All that really matters is that she was a coworker, but even that doesn't really matter. All that matters is that there was someone in between the coffee and Frank. Mind if I get some of that coffee bean goodness you're brewing there?" said Frank in the quirkiest way he knew how. He thought this was really impressive and quick-witted and funny, but it wasn't. And Jessica turned to him with a forced smile and explained how she had just put the coffee pot on, and it'll take a few minutes to be ready. "Epic. I don't mind waiting," replied Frank, as he then proceeded to stand in complete silence until the coffee was finished brewing. Frank had got his coffee and began his way back to his office when he was stopped by his boss once more. His boss looked down at the new cup of coffee in his hand. Frank had a nasty habit of using disposable cups instead of filling up a single mug that he could wash between uses. This would always lead to him cluttering his desk with empty disposable coffee cups. This bothered his boss a great amount, but Frank's boss would never actually tell him how much it bothered him. "I see you're having another cup of coffee this early in the morning." Frank straightened up and replied, holding his eyes as wide open as possible to appear awake. Yes, I need another one to calm my nerves over this projectorino. Frank's boss nodded. Actually, I needed to talk to you about just that thing. Our client will be coming in at 2 today. Do you think you can have the designs ready by then for a presentation? This was exactly what Frank was looking for. He needed something like this to light a fire under his feet, keep him awake for the rest of the day. He'd be too anxious to fall asleep while finishing the designs, and then after the presentation, he'd be riding high for the rest of the day till he could get home and safely get some shut-eye. I can definitely get it done, boss man, Frank diligently replied. Frank returned to his office and began to work on the designs once again. For the following hours, Frank would measure, draw, drink coffee, converse around the office. But as each hour went by, Frank would grow more sleepy and tired. Most of the time, he would sit silently with his eyes closed, focusing on staying awake. He would also make frequent trips to the bathroom, mostly due to his vast intake of coffee. But as a bonus, he was able to splash water on his face to help himself stay awake. So throughout the subsequent hours, Frank became more tired and sleepy and wet-looking, and it was very obvious that the man had gotten very little sleep last night, and his co-workers assumed he probably stayed up late doing something stupid, like playing a Japanese role-playing game on his computer. It was only 10 minutes till the big presentation, and Frank just finished the draft of his designs. Frank jumped out of his seat and clapped his hands in joy, but something was amiss. Frank had never felt this sleepy ever before in his life. He was fighting for his life trying to stay awake. Also, his appearance had drastically changed. His clothes were all wrinkled. His mouth was agape, and he was constantly sucking up drool. He felt like he needed a shower, despite being covered in office bathroom sink water. He felt so gross and sleepy and disheveled, and he was correct in all of these feelings. Just then he heard a knock at the door. "Come in," Frank sounded off as usual. Frank's boss walked in, shocked by Frank's ghastly appearance. "Frank, are you ready for this big, important presentation for our big, important client?" Frank's boss asked. Frank nodded his head yes and sleepily scooped up all of his drawings and followed his boss to the big, important conference room. Frank arrived in the big, important conference room, ready for his big, important presentation. He set up all of his designs on a big, important slideshow presentation to show off to his big, important client. The representative for the client came in through the big doors of the conference room. They were a small man wearing a big suit and a big fedora hat. The suit made them look really wide, even though it was very obvious they were very narrow and small. The small man sat down at the end of the big long conference room table in the big conference room and began to tap his thumbs together. Frank assumed that this meant that he would start his presentation, but just then all of his co-workers and management all piled into the room, sat down at the huge table and all stared at Frank really hard, waiting for him to start his presentation. Frank started to get nervous, but this was actually a good thing that he got nervous because it allowed for him to be more alert throughout his presentation, and that would keep him from falling asleep in front of everyone. Frank began his presentation and really wowed the crowd. He did lots of cool tricks and made lots of funny jokes that made the crowd laugh a lot. His coworkers were slapping their knees at his jokes, and his boss was red in the face and clapping. The little man in the suit was standing on the table, jumping up and down and clapping and squealing in excitement. Everyone was having such a great time. Frank started dancing and singing, and everyone was cheering for him and began to sing and dance along with him. Soon, everyone was dancing around the conference room in a big circle and clapping and laughing and singing and having the time of their lives. Many of the people in the office had never had such a good time in their entire lives. The doors opened to the conference room and in came a man with a big delivery of pizzas. He had at least 40 pies stacked on top of one another. "Anyone order pizza?" he asked smugly. The whole crowd cheered and started throwing the pizza boxes around, grabbing slices here and there. They all chowed down on their pizza and chewed with their mouths open, filling the room with a cacophony of gross mouth noises. But that was okay, because everyone was enjoying themselves and the pizza so much that the obnoxious noises didn't bother them one bit. The presentation ended, and everyone was really satisfied and rubbed their bellies that were full of pizza and were really fat and happy and doing well. The little man rose to his feet and began to slowly applaud. Not too much long after, the rest of the audience began to clap along with him. Soon the whole crowd was giving the loudest and biggest standing ovation that maybe anyone had ever heard ever. It was really awesome. Too awesome to put into words, really. You would have to be there to really know how awesome it was. The little man stopped clapping, and about 10 minutes later, everyone else did too. The little man began to speak. "I am so impressed with this presentation and designs that I am going to pay like 10 times more than what we originally agreed upon because I am so happy right now." And everyone started clapping again and having a great time again. But then everyone turned to look at Frank, who was sat face down at the end of the table. "What is he doing?" asked Frank's boss. "He isn't sleeping, is he?" Everyone moved over to Frank, started poking him to check if he was sleeping. He didn't respond, but he made some weird sleeping sounds and was drooling on the table. He is sleeping." Immediately, the crowd started jumping up and down and shouting, "To the hole! To the hole! To the hole!" This woke Frank up, who was confused until he realized that he had fallen asleep in front of everybody. "No, I wasn't sleeping. I was just, doing my thing." Frank tried to argue, but the crowd wasn't listening. They continued to shout and pick up Frank and rip off all of his clothes and then throw him into the hole.